So class, as we look at a cell, the basic components of a cell include the plasma membrane, or also known as the cell membrane. This membrane is going to surround the outer border of the cell. It defines the boundaries of the cell. And it's going to be made up of a lot of proteins and of a lot of lipids. And particularly, it'll have a lot of phospholipids and cholesterol within it. The proteins that are within the plasma membrane make up a significant portion as well. Oftentimes, these proteins are going to be attached to carbohydrates. As we look at the fluid, or the material on the inside of the cell, I should say, that is referred to as the cytoplasm. And within the cytoplasm, we have these four things that make it up. We have organelles, which include the nucleus. We have the cytoskeleton. We have some inclusions, which is where we store foreign particles, things that normally aren't in the cell but are being temporarily stored in the cell, are going to be referred to as inclusions. And then we finally have the cytosol. The cytosol is the liquid floating around in the inside of the cell, also known as the intra for inside, intracellular fluid, abbreviated ICF in this course. Outside of the cell, or on the external side of the cell membrane, we have extracellular fluid known as ECF. And this is the fluid that's outside of the cells. Oftentimes, this will be referred to as interstitial fluid because it's the fluid that's outside of the cell and outside of the bloodstream. It serves as an interface. So nutrients from the bloodstream can go to the interstitial fluid, and then those nutrients go from the interstitial fluid to the intracellular fluid. Here's a diagram showing many different parts of the cell. As we're looking at this diagram, we can see that we have extensions of the cell, we have connections, we have organelles, we have filaments that make up the cytoskeleton. There are many parts of the cell, and throughout this chapter, we're going to talk about all of these things in more detail. So this is a good summary slide showing the key components of our cells, including the apical surface, which is going to be exposed towards the hollow cavity or the fluid, and then the basal surface, which is typically going to be directly pressed against other cells that are anchoring this cell within the tissue. So as we look at our plasma membrane makes up the border of the cell. Another name for plasma membrane is cell membrane. And when you look at it with an electron microscope, it appears as two dark lines. We have some phospholipids on one layer and some phospholipids on the other layer. And in addition to defining the cell boundary, it also governs the interactions with other cells. It controls how our favorite cell, the cell we're focusing on, communicates and interacts with the cells that are nearby and sending chemical signals from other parts of the body. Our plasma membrane also dictates what gets into and what gets out of the cell. It's the gatekeeper of the cell. And as we're looking at our plasma membrane or cell membrane, overwhelmingly 98% of that cell membrane is going to be made up of lipids. And the lipids that are most common are the phospholipids. We talked about phospholipids when we covered the chapter 2 content. A phospholipid has a amine and phosphate head, a glycerol body, and then 2 fatty acid tails. And most of our plasma membrane is a phospholipid. To review, phospholipids are amphipathic. This means that they have hydrophobic and hydrophilic regions. The hydrophilic portion, the philic meaning love, think of phileo, which is a root word that means sibling love or brotherly love. You can think of Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. Hydrophilic heads are going to face water. They have a polar charge and have a tendency to be facing water. Hydrophobic tails, those fatty acid tails, are nonpolar, and because they're hydrophobic, they tend to be directed towards the center of the phospholipid bilayer so that they avoid contact with water. And these phospholipids are constantly bouncing around within the cell membrane, drifting laterally within the membrane, keeping it very fluid. This sometimes has been referred to as a fluid mosaic model. Here's a figure showing the phospholipids. We typically characterize a phospholipid as a circle with 2 zigzaggy fatty acid tails coming down from it. The circle represents the phosphate head, and then the fatty acid tails are represented by those two zigzaggy lines. And notice how fatty acid tails tend to be exposed to other fatty acid tails. We do not have water molecules in this area in the middle of the phospholipid bilayer. Water is on the extracellular fluid environment, and water is in the intracellular environment. For water to go in and out of the cell, we need a channel protein to allow that fluid to go in and out of the cell. Within our cell membrane, we also have a lot of cholesterol. Cholesterol makes up about 20% of the cell membrane lipids, and it functions to stiffen our cell membrane and also provide rigidity to the phospholipids. We also have a lot of glycolipids, and when we think of these glycolipids make up about 5% of the membrane lipid composition. So they're a minority of the lipids. But glycolipids are exciting because they have carbohydrate chains on the extracellular face of the cell. As we're looking at those carbohydrates that are on the surface of the cell, they make something known as the glycocalyx, which is a carbohydrate coating on the outside of the cell that helps to retain fluid in the extracellular environment. It helps to retain the interstitial fluid of our bodies and maintain water balance. That's all we have for this recording. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to post them in the class discussion board. And as always, happy studies.